The sky over the plains had turned a heavy gray, and the wind carried a sharp bite that cut through the thick coat of a lone cowboy named Tom Rayner. He had been on the trail for 3 long days, trying to find a few missing calves that had wandered off when a fence broke on his ranch. Each step of his horse crunched against the frozen ground, and his breath came out in white clouds. The storm was coming fast. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of storm that didn't care if a man lived or died out there. Snow started to fall, soft at first, then harder, until it blinded his eyes and blurred the land ahead. He pulled his hat lower and tightened his scarf, trying to see through the white wind that seemed to swallow the world. The cold bit at his hands even through his gloves. His horse, a tired old mare named Dusty, snorted and shook her head, her mane stiff with frost. Tom patted her neck gently, whispering, "Just a little further, girl. We'll find shelter soon." But deep inside, he wasn't sure there was any shelter for miles. He had grown up in the Wild West, where the land was beautiful but cruel. He'd seen men freeze on trails just like this, caught between storms and miles of empty ground. He pushed on, guiding Dusty along a faint trail, his eyes scanning for any sign of life, smoke, light, anything. Hours passed and the snow kept falling, each gust of wind colder than the last. His fingers were stiff, his legs numb, and he began to wonder if this was how it would end for him, alone in the storm, forgotten by the world. Then he saw it, just a faint line of smoke rising far ahead, almost lost against the gray sky. He blinked to be sure it wasn't a trick of his tired eyes. No, it was real. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant life. He nudged his horse forward, the hope in his chest pushing back the chill. As he got closer, he saw it wasn't a cabin or a ranch. It was something smaller, built low against a rocky hillside, half hidden under snow. He slowed down when he noticed the markings on the hide that covered the entrance. Symbols painted in red and black, ones he recognized from stories, Apache markings. He stopped. He had heard about them, about how they lived close to the earth, proud and fierce. Some ranchers avoided their lands completely. Tom didn't mean to trespass, but the wind tore through his coat like knives and he couldn't feel his fingers anymore. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach or ride away and risk the cold. Before he could decide, a strong voice cut through the storm. "Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now." Tom turned sharply. A woman stood at the entrance, wrapped in a thick blanket of colorful woven threads. Snow clung to her dark hair and her eyes were steady, unafraid. The storm howled around them, but she didn't move from the doorway. "You'll die out here," she shouted again. "Get inside." Her tone left no room for argument. Tom led his horse behind a large rock and hurried toward her. The moment he stepped through the doorway, the cold lifted a little. Inside, the warmth hit him like a wave. A small fire burned in the center of the shelter, surrounded by stones. Smoke drifted up through a hole in the roof. The air smelled of wood, herbs, and faintly of meat. 2 small children sat by the fire, their eyes wide with surprise as they looked at him. The woman motioned for him to sit down. "You look like a man who's been walking through death," she said calmly. Tom took off his hat and nodded. "Feels about right," he answered, his voice rough from the cold. He lowered himself near the fire, his legs shaking. Steam began to rise from his coat as it thawed. The children whispered to each other in Apache. Their mother said something sharp in her language, and they went quiet. He looked up at her and managed a tired smile. "I didn't mean to come into your land," he said. "My cattle broke through the fence. I went looking for them and got caught in this storm." The woman didn't reply for a moment. Then she said softly, "The storm does not ask who owns the land. It takes all the same." Her words made him smile again, though faintly. "That's true enough, ma'am." She moved with quiet confidence, placing another log on the fire. The light flickered across her face, showing a calm strength that made Tom forget for a moment how cold he'd been. She told him her name was Naya. Her husband had gone out hunting days ago and had not returned yet. The 2 children were her son and daughter. They had been living in this small shelter since autumn, surviving off stored food and what they could find. Tom nodded slowly. He understood survival. Out on the plains, everyone had to fight for it, no matter who they were. As the wind screamed outside, Naya handed him a bowl of hot stew. It was thin but warm, and the taste made his chest ache with gratitude. They didn't speak much as they ate. The fire crackled softly, and the sound of the wind outside filled the silence between them. When he finally thanked her, she looked at him for a long time and said, "My father once found a wounded soldier in the desert. The man was nearly dead. My father gave him water. Later, that same soldier saved my father from a flood. The world remembers kindness. That is why I do not close my door to strangers. Tom felt something tighten in his chest. Then your father was a wise man, he said quietly. Naya shrugged lightly. He said kindness is like fire. It can warm many even if the giver grows cold. They talked more as the night went on. Tom told her about his ranch, how he'd been trying to keep it going since his brother died last spring. He told her about Dusty, his old horse, who had carried him through storms before. Naya listened without interrupting, her eyes calm and understanding. Every so often she would glance at her children to make sure they were asleep. As the fire burned lower, Tom realized how peaceful he felt. It had been a long time since he'd talked to anyone like this. The shelter was simple, just hides, branches, and earth, but it felt more like a home than his cold ranch house had in months. He laid down near the fire, his hat over his eyes. He could still hear the storm outside, but it didn't sound as threatening now. It was just part of the land, like the mountains and the wind itself. He drifted to sleep to the sound of Naya softly humming something in her language, a song that carried warmth even through the howling night. When he woke up, light filled the small shelter. The storm had passed. The sky outside was bright, the snow glittering like silver across the canyon. He sat up slowly, his body sore but alive. Naya was already awake, feeding the fire and stirring a pot. Her children were outside, laughing softly as they played near the rocks. Tom stood and put on his coat. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. Naya looked up from the fire. "The wind brought you here," she said simply. "I only opened the door." He smiled, knowing she meant more than the words said. Before he left, he helped chop wood and carry water. The air was cold but fresh, and the land looked peaceful under the blanket of snow. When his horse was ready, he turned to her one last time. "If you ever need anything, ma'am, you'll find me near Red Creek, Rainer Ranch." She nodded. "I will remember." He rode away slowly, glancing back once to see her standing there with the morning light behind her, the smoke from her fire curling into the sky. He didn't know why it felt so hard to leave. Maybe because in that short night something had changed inside him, a kind of warmth that no storm could ever take away. As he disappeared into the white hills, the wind picked up again, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a whisper, a reminder of the voice that had called out through the storm. "Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now." And for the rest of his life, those words would stay with him, not as a command, but as a memory of kindness found in the coldest of places. The winter storm had passed, but its memory stayed in Tom Rainer's mind like a brand. The sky was blue again, and the sun shone over the white plains, but every time he looked toward the canyon, he could still hear that voice in his head, clear and firm. "Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now." When he finally reached his ranch after that long and frozen journey, he found the place half buried in snow. The wind had torn down his fences, the barn roof had caved in, and several of his cattle had wandered off or frozen in the cold. He stood there in silence for a long time, staring at the mess that had once been his pride. Dusty, his old horse, lowered her head and snorted softly, as if to say they'd made it home even if it didn't look much like home anymore. Tom took a deep breath and got to work. For the next several weeks, he worked from sunrise to dark, repairing what the storm had destroyed. His hands bled from the cold nails and splintered wood, but he didn't complain. That was the cowboy way, fix what breaks no matter how bad it gets. But even as he worked, something inside him had changed. He thought about that small shelter made of hides and stones. He remembered the warmth of the fire, the smell of stew, and the calm voice of the Apache woman who had saved him. Sometimes at night, when the wind moved across the plains, he would look out from his porch and imagine he could see that faint line of smoke again, rising from her canyon. He didn't know why, but he felt like he owed her something more than just words. When spring came and the snow melted, the land turned green again. Streams ran through the fields and the birds returned to the open sky. The long cold season had ended and Tom's ranch began to breathe again. He repaired every broken fence, brought in new calves, and made sure his land stood strong. Yet no matter how much work he did, a part of him remained restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see that woman again, to thank her properly, to make sure she and her children were safe. One clear morning, he packed a saddlebag with flour, dried meat, sugar, and a new wool blanket. He tied it behind his saddle, mounted Dusty, and rode out toward the canyon. The journey took most of the day. The sun was warm and the air smelled of grass and pine. As he got closer to the rocky slope where the shelter had been, his heart started to beat faster. He expected to see the same hide tent, the same smoke, maybe even the same sound of children's laughter. But when he arrived, the place was empty. The ground was bare except for a black patch of ashes. The shelter was gone, the stones scattered, and the land looked quiet and lonely. Tom dismounted and knelt beside the ashes. He touched the earth. It was cold, but the memory of that fire still lived in his mind. He stood up and looked around, scanning the land for signs of footprints. Then near the edge of the canyon, he saw small tracks, 2 sets of tiny footprints and one larger. His heart lifted. They were still nearby. He followed the tracks along a trail that led toward the river. When he reached the riverbank, he heard laughter, light and happy, the kind only children could make. He smiled and walked forward. There, beside the water, was Naya. She was kneeling by the river, helping her children catch fish using a bent branch and a thin cord. The sight made Tom's chest feel lighter than it had in months. When she noticed him, she didn't look surprised. She smiled faintly and said, "The cowboy comes back." Tom smiled too and set his saddlebag down beside her. "Brought you something," he said. "Flour, sugar, blanket, for the help you gave me that night." Naya looked at the supplies, then at him. "I told you the wind brought you," she said. "But I will not say no to food." They both laughed softly. Her children ran to him and stared up with bright eyes. The little boy said, "You are the man from the snow." Tom nodded, smiling. "That's me, the fool who nearly froze." They sat by the river together, sharing a small meal of fish roasted on sticks. The sound of the water mixed with the soft rustle of leaves. For a long time, none of them spoke. Tom watched the children play in the sunlight and thought about how different their worlds were, yet how peaceful this moment felt. After a while, Naya spoke quietly. "The men of the valley saw your tracks that night," she said. "They think you came to harm us." Tom's smile faded. "I'd never hurt you or your family." "I know," she said quickly. "But they do not. They remember old things. Things done long ago." Tom nodded slowly. He understood. The West was full of old wounds between ranchers and natives, settlers and tribes. Many had died before peace ever had a chance to grow. "Maybe someday," he said softly, "people will stop judging by old scars." Naya looked at him, her eyes calm but sad. "Maybe," she said, "if they remember the fire we shared." The sun began to set, painting the river gold. Tom helped her gather the fishing gear and pack the fish in a basket. The children skipped stones across the water, their laughter echoing down the canyon. When everything was done, Tom stood by his horse, feeling the weight of the moment. "I should head back before dark," he said. Naya nodded. "The trail is safe now. The snow is gone." She paused, then added softly, "The world is big, cowboy, but sometimes paths cross again." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. The children came running to him. The little girl held out something small wrapped in cloth. When he opened it, he found a tiny carved eagle made of white bone. "For the man who came from the storm," she said shyly. Tom smiled, touched beyond words. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll take care of it." He mounted Dusty and looked down at Naya one last time. The evening light shone across her face and the river glowed behind her like silver glass. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he tipped his hat and said, "You take care now." She raised her hand in farewell and he turned his horse toward the horizon. Years passed, but Tom never forgot that day, or that winter night when a stranger had saved his life without asking who he was or where he came from. The West changed over time. Towns grew, railroads came, and people started to forget the old ways. But on Tom's ranch, near the fireplace in his cabin, a small carved eagle always hung from a nail above the mantel. He never told anyone the full story behind it. When asked, he only said, "It came from a friend who once saved me from a storm." Sometimes, when the wind blew hard through the plains, he would close his eyes and imagine the warmth of that shelter again. The crackling fire, the sound of Naya's soft voice, and the peace that came from knowing kindness could still be found in the hardest places. And though he never saw her again, he liked to think that somewhere beyond the canyons, the Apache woman still remembered him too. The cowboy who stumbled through the storm and found a friend instead of an enemy. As the years went by and his hair turned gray, He still rode the same trail every spring, stopping for a while near the river where he had last seen her. He would sit there quietly, listening to the sound of water and wind, and sometimes he thought he could almost hear a faint voice in the breeze saying, "Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now." Then he would smile softly to himself, tip his hat to the empty air, and ride home under the wide, endless sky of the Wild West, carrying the memory of that one night that had changed his heart forever.